They lost their homes, their businesses, their constitutional rights, all stripped away during World War II. For almost 4 years, Japanese Americans lived behind barbed wire in concentration camps right here in the U.S. And as we continue to bridge the divide, 13 Action News reporter Alicia Patillo takes you back in time for a day of remembrance.
Day of Remembrance is an event that most Japanese Americans reflect on.
On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Japanese forces attacked a U.S. naval base in Hawaii, killing nearly 2,400 Americans and injuring 1,000 more. While the attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise, Japan and the United States had been at odds for years, and this was the match that ignited a war.
On Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
On December 8, 1941, one day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared war on Japan.
Hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, 1,291 Japanese were rounded up by the FBI hours after the attack. And they were fishermen captains, religious leaders, community leaders, all over the West Coast. So the question becomes, how did they know these people to go after them only hours after the attack? It's obvious. There was information being collected on them even before the start of the war.
Way back before I was born, there was a hatred against all Asians, not only Japanese, but Chinese, other Asian races, especially on the western section of this country, because that's where a lot of the immigrants who were working to help build the railroads during the 1800s, they settled along the West Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington.
On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. Under the direction and pressure of advisors, the West Coast was designated as a military area, and the order gave commanders the power to exclude civilians from a military zone.
All Japanese in the states of California, Oregon, and Washington shall be removed from their homes and placed into the prison camps. There were 10 of them, 120,000 people. Most of us were American citizens.
San Mihara, a second-generation Japanese American born in California, was only 9 years old in the summer of 1942 when he and his family were ripped away from their homes and forced by military guards to relocate to a concentration camp in Heart Mountain, Wyoming.
When I arrived there on a train, it was a prison train. All the exits were guarded by armed guards and taken on a truck, put us in the backs of the trucks with our one suitcase per person. I remember seeing the barbed wire fences. There were 9 guard towers. Each tower had a soldier with a long-range rifle. And there were signs along the fence that says, "Do not cross this border."
While Americans fought against tyranny overseas, the land of the free also experienced a dark time. Conditions inside the camps were inhumane, and for 3 years, this is how Mihara and his family lived.
There was no water, there's no electricity. The walls were not insulated. That winter, it got down to minus 28 degrees, unprepared. The government never told us we were going to northern Wyoming. We didn't bring the right clothing. and it was miserable.
As the days and months grew into years, redemption seemed impossible, and the scars endured from camp lasted a lifetime.
My father went blind inside the camp. He had a case of glaucoma of his eyes, and General DeWitt would not let him go back to visit his own eye doctor.
Wayne Tanaka's father, a minister, was one of many Japanese Americans locked away in the camps in 1942. Tanaka says the camps were more than just an attack on American civil rights.
Some of the sadness associated with this was more than just the incarceration of Japanese American citizens. There were citizens who died in the camps, who never knew it would end.
The last camp closed in 1946. It wasn't until 1976 when President Gerald Ford repealed Executive Order 9066. 12 years later, in 1988, Congress passed and President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, awarding $20,000 each to more than 80,000 Japanese Americans for the violation of their human rights. A federal commission issued a report calling the incarceration of Japanese Americans unjust and the result of race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. On February 19th of every year, Japanese Americans will never forget. It is the day of remembrance.
What happened to us should not happen again to anyone else.
Alicia Batillo, 13 Action News.
Alicia has been tracking so many of these stories for us. You can find a whole bunch of her stories online at ktmv.com.